every single year, which puts me on the road quite a bit. My husband and my son are with us here today, and we just love what we do. We love what we do because we love where we came from. And we want to see America be again who it's supposed to be. But we've come so far from that for so very long. And we've been teaching the wrong things about America for so long that it's hard to have a conversation with people and explain what needs to happen. Because in America, very few people, this room excluded, I'm sure, actually know what kind of government we have. I mean, think about this. How are you going to even broach the conversation about how the Constitution is supposed to work if the most Americans don't even know what kind of government we have?
That's true.
So this class is, I teach lots of classes, and when I stand up to teach a class, I always say that class is my favorite class. But I really like this class because I think it gives us an understanding of how far we've come and how much we've been deceived. I teach all kinds of groups. I don't discriminate. I would teach anybody the Constitution who invited me, even Dianne Feinstein. Or Nancy Pelosi. I would teach them if they wanted me to. I'm not going to hold that back because I don't think I have a license on this truth. I think it belongs to everybody, and I think that everybody needs to hear it. But quite often, people will say to me, but Krissanne, what actually are you accomplishing because you're always preaching to the choir? Sometimes the choir needs to be educated as well. Can I get an amen? Amen. So I want you, as we go through this class this afternoon, to think to yourself a few questions. Why didn't I learn this? And I'm confident in saying that there will be many things today you have never learned. I have taught this particular class to men and women who have PhDs in American history, political science, and government. I have taught Supreme Court justices on the state level, all of whom told me that they learned more in this class than they did in their entire education. Now, that is not patting me on the back. That is an indictment on our educational system and the way it has existed for decades. So I want you to think to yourself, how different would America be today, and what would our future look like if we had been teaching this truth? How different can we make America if we start teaching this truth? Samuel Adams said, "No people will tamely surrender their liberties nor be easily subdued when knowledge is diffused and virtue is preserved." He said, but on the contrary, when the people become universally ignorant and debauched in their manners, they will sink underneath their own weight without the aid of foreign invaders. I do appreciate the concern that we have about Islam coming into the Western world. I really do appreciate that concern. I think it is a very legitimate concern. However, the founders of America would tell you that Washington, D.C. has done more to damage and destroy the liberty in America than any Islamic faction could ever dream of doing. And it's because we the people have forgotten who we are. For example, how many of you have heard your friends, your family members, the talking heads on television, even on the conservative networks, and even your most favorite conservative politicians refer to America as a democracy? How many of you heard that? Okay? It's not true, right? We know that. But I think if we knew that, I think if we deeply recognized and understood the insidious danger of that lie continually floating out in the ether of our American conversation, being uttered by the people that we respect as the conservators of our liberty, we wouldn't just sort of shake our head and roll our eyes when we hear it. We would be nail-biting, spitting mad. Because you see, our founders had a great deal of discussion on what kind of government we ought to be. They didn't just throw it up in the air and see what would stick. When I teach this class to the young people, I ask them, who fought in the Revolutionary War? And a lot of times the answer is the Americans and the British. Only that's not true, because there were no Americans in our Revolutionary War. It was the British people fighting their own government. Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, George Mason, Samuel Adams were all British. Paul Revere didn't ride the countryside screaming, "The British are coming," because he was British. Everybody was. And the government that they lived under on our soil prior to our independence was a kingdom.
What did he?
And that's all they had known for 700 years. So as an historian, I ask myself, why aren't we the kingdom of America? You might be tempted to sort of chuckle. Well, of course we wouldn't be the kingdom of America, but why not? How many of you remember from your civics or history class that after a major battle after a major win in our battle for independence, there were people begging George Washington to be king? Okay, so there's your proof. That's how close we were to being the kingdom of America. But we had some brilliant people who had studied history, who had studied government, who knew what government and people always do when they interact with each other. It's why Patrick Henry said, "I have but one lamp by which my feet are guided, and that is the lamp of experience. I know no way to judge the future but by the past." It's why Alexander Hamilton said experience is the oracle of truth, and where its responses are unequivocal, they ought to be held to be sacred and conclusive. They picked up this lamp of experience. They listened to that oracle of truth, and they knew they had one thing they wanted to do. You see, achieving independence from Great Britain was not just the goal. That was the mechanism to achieve the goal. The goal was liberty. The Declaration of Independence declares it. The preamble to the Constitution tells us that's the stated purpose for the government and the creation of our union, to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. The Bill of Rights, the whole purpose of the Bill of Rights was to be an alarm, a visible barrier in the eyes and the minds of the people to secure their own liberty, to keep government from transgressing, abridging, or infringing upon it. It was the single thing they were looking for, the securing of their liberty. And they knew that in a kingdom they could not do that. Because when you live in a kingdom, the king holds all the power, and he hands out the rights and the privileges to the people as he sees fit. Now, if the king holds all the power, and he's handing out the rights and the privileges to the people as he sees fit, what does he have the power to do?
Take it back again.
To take it away. Very good. Thank you. And I hope you all will feel free, this is to answer the questions with just that kind of boldness and confidence, because that's what we need in America now. Boldness and confidence to speak truth. So if you live in a kingdom, you only have what you have as long as the king wants you to have it. You only get what you get if he wants you to have it. So you'll wake up every day wondering what's right and what's wrong, because today something's legal, tomorrow it's illegal because the king woke up in a bad mood. Kingdoms do not secure liberty. They only secure that there will always be a king and always be subjects. Our founders created a constitutional republic. In a constitutional republic, that is the style of government that we are. A constitutional republic, the only form of government that can secure that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. It's the only form of government that can secure that. It is the only form of government in which the people hold all the power, in which they delegate power to the government as they see fit. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just power from the consent of the government. Y'all recognize that text, right? Yes. So in a republic, we have all the power. We delegate power to the government as we see fit. What do we have the authority to do?
Take it back.
Take it back. Because in a republic, we are the kings and government is the subject.
Thank God we're going to let them know it.
But if we have a political spectrum, we have a kingdom over here, we must recognize that a republic is the exact opposite of a kingdom. But now we have a majority of America calling us a democracy. So if we have this spectrum, where does democracy fit? Over here close to a republic, somewhere in the middle perhaps. Well, the truth be told, there really is no difference between a democracy and a kingdom. The only real difference between a democracy and a kingdom is how many people rule over you. In a democracy, it's the majority, which can also be interpreted not just as the majority of the people, but whomever holds the majority of power or the majority of money. And then the power of government, the control of government, rests in those people who consist of the most, whatever that might be. And then the majority hands out to the minority whatever they see fit. And if the majority is handing out to the minority, what can the majority do? Take it back. So you see, if you live in a democracy and you are not amongst the most group, what you only have as long as they want you to have it, and you only get what they want you to get. Equality does not exist in a democracy. The very form of government is antithetical to equality because you have to decide who's the most. How many of you heard of a lady named Rosa Parks? Rosa Parks proves that we are not a democracy. Had we been a democracy, Rosa Parks would still be sitting at the back of the bus. Because in a democracy, a minority group never and will never have a society-changing voice. Only in a constitutional republic, where laws are created through equal representation, can a minority group have a say in government. Only can a minority group have any kind of opportunity, and only in a constitutional republic can there actually be equality in liberty. Now, living in a democracy might be okay if you're in the majority. But remember, history also proves that today's majority is tomorrow's minority. So you better enjoy it while you're on top, because it will not last. But here's another axiomatic truth. If you speak a lie long enough, people will begin to believe it to be true. And that's where you get this nonsense about America being a democracy, one person, one vote. No, that just means you're all slaves. Because the only thing that a democracy will secure is that there will always be masters and always be slaves. And I'm fairly certain, looking across this crowd, that that's not the future that you want for your children or your grandchildren. Am I right? Then we need to start correcting this speech. And And we need to not be intimidated to correct people, even if we think they're good guys. Because if we are going to restore the greatness of America, that will not happen in Washington, D.C. As much as we have hope in Donald Trump, as much as Americans may be hoping about what will happen in the future, Donald Trump cannot fix what's wrong with America because he is just the President of the United States. And constitutionally speaking, the power that he has is very, very limited. And in order for him to do what he needs to do to actually fix America, America will have to transform the office of a president into a king. And we don't want that. Because the power you trust in the hands of Trump today is the same power that will be exercised when the next guy gets in. Or lady. That's why this class is so important. We have to restore ourselves to these foundational principles of liberty. We must be a dedicated people to principle over party, security or liberty over security, and truth over personality. We must be just as willing to watch Donald Trump as closely as we watched Barack Obama. Because there's no perfect man. And when he returns, that perfect man, I'm not going to care about government anymore. Our Constitution is not an arbitrary document. Our Constitution was written specifically to be a standard of operation to keep the government from becoming arbitrary. And it's the history of our Constitution that proves the relevance of the Constitution today and the necessity to adhere to its principles. But you cannot do that in a society that thinks that the Constitution needs to be interpreted. The last time I checked, it wasn't written in Mandarin Chinese. The Constitution does not need interpretation. It needs application. And we actually have access to absolutely everything we need to know about how it's supposed to work. And that history that builds it. 700 years, that's what we're going to talk about today. 700 years. 700 years of history that wrote our Constitution. It wasn't written in 1789. Liberty was not invented in 1776. The British forefathers of our founders battled in a struggle for 700 years to secure the liberty of the people and limit their government. It was these lessons that our founders learned from, so they knew exactly what they needed to do to put in written terms the limited and defined nature of our government so that the people would not have to repeat the mistakes of their own history. This history, believe it or not, begins in 1014. And from 1014 to 1689, there are 5 documents that were written that I call the genealogy of our Constitution. It's the family tree. From these 5 documents, we get everything that is embodied within our Declaration of Independence, our Constitution, and our Bill of Rights. We invented nothing. Our Constitution is not an invention, it is an inheritance. And through the understanding of this history, we know exactly how our Constitution was written to work and why it was written the way it was to be written, and how our Constitution can never be seen as a living, breathing document. But you see, I can judge by your response that you all pretty much agree with that statement. But how? How do we take back the narrative? How do we get victory in truth if we cannot argue the truth ourselves? In 1014, there is no England, no Great Britain, no United Kingdom. There is only a land where the Anglo-Saxon people live, which is, by the way, where we get the term England. It is a blending in the words of Anglo-land. Anglo-land became England. But in this time, in 1014, the Anglo-Saxons have no king. They've been recently ruled by the Danes. The Danish king died. They pushed aside the Danish kingdom, and they are resisting kingly rule. They are now, in this period of history, governing themselves in small communities. And they're doing a very good job of it. Very, very successful. They have peace internally. They have great prosperity. And they are doing such a good job of it that they're actually garnering the attention again of the Danes and other outside kingdoms. These kingdoms looking in on the Anglo-Saxons, admiring their internal peace and prosperity, but then scratching their heads and saying, you know, they have all this stuff, but they're missing something. They don't have a king. They must need one. And so these Anglo-Saxons are left to fend and defend themselves from these foreign attacks. But they're having a difficulty in doing so. Because when you live in a small community in 1014, the neighboring community is probably a good day's ride away. So if the sentinel of your tower sees the king's men coming to attack, you're not picking up your cell phone and texting the neighbor saying it's time to gather the troops. So they recognize that they're having a problem. Now I want you to listen very closely to what I'm about to say, because I'm choosing my words very carefully. They were having a difficult time organizing for their common defense. Does that phraseology sound familiar to anybody? Okay. Not only that, they also recognize that the best way to keep peace with a foreign kingdom is to be able to make treaties with a foreign king. If you can make trade treaties and peace treaties, then they'll have an investment in you and they probably won't be as anxious to conquer you. But the Anglo-Saxons have a problem because, you see, kings negotiate treaties with other kings. And if you don't have a king, how many of you think that kings are going to negotiate with common people?
Nope.
It's not going to happen. So they recognize they have some problems, and they go and fall back on the only thing that they know. And they said, well, maybe we need to have a king. So in 1014, they go to this man named Ethelred. And they're going to take the kingdom style of government and change it just slightly. They will have a monarchy, but a new kind of monarchy. You see, they're going to tell Ethelred, we will allow you to be our king on one condition. Your only job will be to help us organize for our common defense, and you will also make treaties for us with foreign kingdoms, but you have no power internally in our communities, and you will leave us alone to govern ourselves. Your only authority is external. They created a limited monarchy. The king is limited in power by the delegation of the people. Now here's the thing, if we'd been teaching the Constitution properly for the last 150 years, there'd be light bulbs going off over everybody's head right now, because we would recognize right now the parallel between the agreement made with Ethelred and the agreement that the states made with each other when they created the federal government through the Constitution. How many of you heard of a guy named James Madison? Anybody know what nickname history has deemed James Madison to have?
Father of the Constitution.
Say that again louder.
Father of the Constitution.
Father of the Constitution. James Madison is called the father of our Constitution, and he wrote a document that we call Federalist 45. And in this document he says the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those that remain in the states are numerous and indefinite. He says the powers delegated to the federal government will be exercised principally on external objects. And then he names them: war, peace, negotiation, foreign commerce. He says every other power, to include the lives, the liberties, the properties of the people, the internal order, improvement, and prosperity of the state, are reserved to the states. We created a federal government whose primary responsibility and job duty was foreign affairs. They were supposed to be leaving our states alone to govern ourselves. And the very foundation upon who we are is taken as an inheritance from an agreement in 1014. One thing always happens when you have people involved with anything. Human nature gets involved. And here's the thing that happens. You start calling somebody a king. You ought not be surprised when he starts acting like one. And when the people start looking at their government to be their protector and their provider, you ought not be surprised when the people start acting like subjects. So in just 30 years, the king is Edward the Confessor, and the people love Edward as they describe him to be a generous king. Now I want you to think about this. Under the Ethelred Agreement, does the king have the authority to be generous?
No.
Just 30 years, and that's how far we've come. Why? Because human nature says that people like free stuff. And if the king is handing out free stuff, you're not likely to ask where it came from or what it might cost you later. Now here's the problem for the Anglo-Saxons and their love for Edward. He's about to die and he has no son, which means there's no direct heir. That means they have to go to a list of cousins who are next in line to be king. And next in line to be king is this man. His name is William I. Now William I knows that he has a blood right to be king. But we have a problem because the Anglo-Saxons do not want William to be their king. And under the Ethelred Agreement, they have established that they have the right at times to choose their king, which is all new. Because usually kings are born, right? So even if you're born in the right family and in the right, you have to be born in the right birth order. If you're the fourth born of 4 sons, you don't get to be king unless you can what? Kill off 3 brothers, right? How many of you know that happened? A lot. Okay, it's going to happen in our history. But now we have a situation where William believes that he has a right to be king, but the Anglo-Saxons don't want him to be king because William is not Anglo-Saxon. You see, they learned quite some time ago that foreign law brings the destruction of liberty. So they hatch out this plan to appoint this guy to be king, Harold Godwinson. He was Edward's right-hand man. They're fairly certain that he's going to be generous in the way that Edward was generous, but we have a problem now. Because politically and socially speaking, Harold has no blood right to be king. And William catches wind that they're trying to pass him over to be king, which makes him very angry. Which is also bad news for the Anglo-Saxons because William carries a nickname. He is called William the Conqueror.
Yep.
What do you suppose happens when you make a guy mad whose nickname is the Conqueror? What's he gonna do? Well, William is from Normandy, which is one of the reasons why the Anglo-Saxons do not want him to be king, because Norman kings rule in your stereotypical kingly manner. I say, you do, or else. And Now, William raises his Norman army. He goes over and defeats Harold and the English people in a very famous battle that you probably learned about in this in school if you went to school, if you started school before 1980. It's called the Battle of Hastings. How many of you remember learning about the Battle of Hastings? How many of you, when you learned the Battle of Hastings, learned that the Battle of Hastings was important in understanding the Constitution of the United States? Just a few. Well, William has now won. Harold has now died. And William is king. William is not willing to rule in the limited fashion of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. He wants to be a Norman king with unlimited power. But he also recognizes something about human nature. He has just had to conquer these people to become king, which means he's not very popular, right? Now, by law, the king can issue decrees from the throne. That's literally writing law from the throne. And he could, legally speaking, issue a decree that says, I am a Norman, therefore we will now all rule under Norman law, and my decree says that we will follow Norman law. He could do that. But he also recognizes that's probably not a very good idea. Because when you don't like your kingdom, do you start a recall? You don't like your king, rather. Do you start a recall petition to remove him from the throne? Do you find a new king to run against him in the next kingly election? No. When you don't like your king, what do you got to do? Right, you raise up a rebellion and you chop off his head. William knows this. He wants to keep his throne and his head at the same time. So he thinks against writing a decree, but then develops a plan in which he can change the law of the land, not by rewriting the law, but instead by fundamentally transforming the kingdom in such a way that the people don't even notice. So if you want to change the law of the land without rewriting it, what is the easiest and most effective way to do that? You replace the judges in the legal system with judges who are not loyal to the law of the land, but loyal to the ideologies of the king. That way, these judges will now take his foreign law and impose it on the people of the kingdom, even when it's contrary to their own law, and the people will not say anything because there's something in our brain that makes us trust judges.
No, not anymore.
We call it an impartial, independent judiciary. Yeah, right. How's that one working out for us?
Yeah.
Well, the interesting thing is, in Norman law, William has an advantage. Because you see, he starts using the law and the force of government to chase the landowners off of their land. How do you ensure that there's not a rebellion? Well, you have to chase off the dissenters. So anybody who has found or mentioned or said anything in disagreement to the king is now going to be chased off their land, sometimes even completely out of the kingdom. And the thing is, Norman law says that when land becomes abandoned, the ownership of the land returns to the king. And so now the king's able to look out over the kingdom and say, oh, look at all this abandoned land. And he starts inviting all his foreign friends to come live in the kingdom. Because after you kick out the dissenters, you got to fill the kingdom with people who either like you, fear you, or want something from you in order to keep away the rebellion. Now in this era, the churches are very, very powerful as well, and William's not going to let this power slip through his fingers either. He starts replacing the leadership in the churches, the way he did the judges on the bench, with leaders that will be loyal to the king and not to their faith. So now he can convince the people that they must do whatever the king says, even if it's contrary to the word of God. This transformation process takes place over a period of about 40 years through the reign of William I and his son, William II. Now you will notice that William II is only going to rule for about 13 years. Because one day, William II and his little brother, Henry I, are going to go hunting together. You see, William II is described as being a wicked, evil king, just like his father. And on this hunting trip, there is a mysterious hunting accident where William is accidentally killed when a stray arrow from his brother's hunting party accidentally kills him. How many believe in the accident story? Well, it cannot be argued. Henry is king. And it is true that the people did not like his brother. But the people also recognize something. That if Henry will murder his own brother to become king, what is the value of the lives of the people to him? Henry realizes that he has some problems, and he wants to keep his head and his throne at the same time. So he starts immediately trying to do some things to appease the people. One of the things that Henry does is he comes to the people and he says, look, I realize the circumstances surrounding the death of my brother may seem a bit suspicious. So I want to do you a service. Put your minds at ease. And here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to scour the entire kingdom. And I'm going to identify the 3 wisest men in all of our land. And after I, your loving king, has identified these 3 wise men, I'm going to bring them here to my court. And they're going to conduct an investigation to determine whether I'm at fault for the death of my brother or not. Some of you know the story then, right? What do you suppose the verdict was of this grand tribunal? Innocent. Now here's the thing. The English people were not believing this investigation at all. But I have to wonder, if William had had a little, or if Henry had had a little bit of modern wisdom, if instead of calling the investigation a grand tribunal, what if he had called it a congressional hearing? Do you suppose the people would have believed it? I don't know, it seems to work for the American people. Now, Henry has been will do a number of things, but the most important thing that Henry will do in the history of our Constitution, remember I told you there were 5 documents. Henry's going to write the very first one. It is called the 1100 Charter of Liberties. The 1100 Charter of Liberties is Henry's promise that government will never be evil and oppressive again. How's that working out? Henry makes a list of 14 things that government is never allowed to do again, because if a government engages in this activity, the people will be on notice that they have an evil and oppressive government, and they will be righteously justified to resist that government. Now, we're not going to go over all 14, but I did want to show you one. Henry says, if any of my baron or earls shall die. Now, the barons and the earls are the landowners. Remember, we had trouble with the Williams stealing land from the people. Henry says, I'm not going to be like my father and brother. If any of the landowners die, their heirs will not have to purchase their inheritance, but shall retrieve it through force of law and custom. What Henry is saying is if the heirs of an estate have to pay the government before they can receive their inheritance, you have an evil and oppressive government. Is that ringing any bells out there? What was that? Inheritance tax? How many of you heard inheritance tax? Death tax. Isn't that exactly what that is? How is it that a king in 1100 who had no cell phone knew that when you have to pay the IRS or your son has to pay the IRS before they can get what you already paid for, that you have an evil and oppressive government. And yet today we allow our government to call it revenue. Could it be because we haven't been teaching the right things for a very long time? Now, Henry isn't interested in liberty. He's interested in keeping his head and his throne. But this promise will do just that for him, but even more. Because this is a promise signed and sealed by the king that is to bind every single king in the future. And they're going to need this promise because in 100 years, they're going to have the most evil king they'll ever know. His name is John. John is a massive taxation king. And if you cannot pay your taxes in John's kingdom, which is quite likely, you're going to be arrested, thrown into prison, mutilated. John is cutting off hands, feet, ears, cutting the tongues out of people who cannot afford to pay their taxes. He's even executing people. They called him ruthless and vicious. A little bit of historical trivia for you, by the way. John is the first king to impose income tax on the people. You guys know John, by the way. You probably don't realize it. How many of you know this guy? Robin Hood. That's the king in the Robin Hood story. How many of you, just as a little aside poll, how many of you think that we don't teach history very accurately anymore? Well, then you probably won't be surprised to know we don't even teach our legends accurately anymore. By show of hand, show me how many of you have heard this about Robin Hood. Robin Hood robs from the rich to give to the poor. How many of you heard that? It's not true. Robin Hood was not robbing from the rich to give to the poor in an effort to redistribute wealth. Robin Hood was taking from the king and the crown the money that had been stolen from the people through oppressive and unlawful taxation and returning it to the people so they could live. Remember, John is going to execute you if you cannot pay your taxes. Robin Hood is not a socialist trying to put everybody on equal financial footing. Robin Hood is a liberty fighter giving people their lives back. Because the first step to liberty is always a right to life. Because if you have to pay the government for the privilege of living, then what kind of person are you? Now, John and his era of history and then histories before him prove one simple thing about human nature. Murdering people for not paying their taxes is not enough to bring the people to point of rebellion. Because John and those like him have figured out that if you can keep the society of people focused on stuff, all you have to do is trickle down just enough stuff to make them comfortable and complacent and compliant. And then you can do anything and the people will never push back. Because they will value their comfort more than their freedom. But history also tells us that governments get power drunk. And that one day they'll do something that actually makes the people uncomfortable in their liberty and they will fight back. John's error is he inserts himself in the church. The people have chosen a man by the name of Stephen Langton to be the head of their church. John steps up and says, I don't like this guy. I'm going to pick the leader of your church. Here's the problem. John's already forgotten about the 1100 Charter of Liberties because the very first promise Henry made said that the church will be completely free from government intrusion. That, by the way, is the definition of separation of church and state. Separation of church and state is not established to protect the government, it is established to protect the church. Separation of church and state since the year 300 has always meant that the government has no business in your church. And if your government is in your church, you have an evil and oppressive government. It has only been since our most recent bout of educated ignorance that we have become to accept the deception that separation of church and state means that God has no business in public discussion. That is radical. A rebellion comes against John, which gives us the second document in the history of our Constitution. This one is called the Magna Carta. Little pop quiz. Everybody in the room knows the answer to this question because I just taught you. Who wrote the 1100 Charter of Liberties? Henry I, right? Well, here's the thing we have to recognize. John did not write the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta was written by the people. And the Magna Carta cannot exist without the 1100 Charter of Liberties, because the Magna Carta is the people standing up to the king saying, hey, you made us a promise in 1100 that government would never be evil and oppressive again. You obviously do not know how to keep your promises. So now we, the people, will rise in our majesty. We are now going to tell the king what he can and cannot do to ensure that he's keeping his promises. The Magna Carta establishes a committee of 25 men called the Royal Council who will sit in the king's court with the authority to point their finger in the face of the king and say, no, you can't do that because it violates our liberty. How many of you are familiar with the Bill of Rights? Our 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th Amendments in the Bill of Rights were not invented. They all come from clauses 38 through 40 in the Magna Carta. Clause 61 of the Magna Carta is where we get a very important part of our First Amendment. And now you're going to get your second pop quiz of the day. This time we have new rules. No answering out loud. Okay? No looking in your pocket constitutions. No searching your tablets or your cell phones. No calling for a lifeline. As a matter of fact, I don't even want you to lip sync the answers because I don't want your neighbor cheating off you. Everybody agree to those terms? So here you go. Clause 61 of Magna Carta gives us a very important part of our First Amendment. Our First Amendment actually has 5 liberties in it. To yourself, not out loud, I want you to name all 5 liberties of the First Amendment. I came to you from Florida. We have a Supreme Court justice in Florida who took a poll of Floridians, asked this question, found out that only 2% of the people polled could name all 5. Now, I don't know where you fall in that statistic, but I do want to ask you this question. If you do not know what your rights are, how do you know they're not already gone? The Constitution does not protect your rights. You have no constitutional rights because your rights don't come from the Constitution. They come by the nature of your creation. And the Constitution does not protect your rights because it is a piece of paper with ink on it. It cannot pick up a sword to defend your rights, and it cannot sit in your senator's office and demand compliance. Our founders called our Constitution, these are their words, a parchment barrier, because they knew the only defense of your liberty did not rest in the Constitution, but in the jealousy and the vigilance of the people to recognize and defend their own rights. And if you can't define your liberty, how in the world are you going to defend it? Because the only defender of your liberty is sitting in your seat right now. And the terrible thing is, the liberty that we lose today is the liberty that's already lost for our children. Samuel Adams said, when we tamely suffer a lawless attack upon our liberty, we encourage it. And we involve others in our doom. He says it's a serious consideration that should weigh heavy upon our hearts, that ages and millions yet unborn will be the miserable sharers of our experience. Liberty is not a gift that you keep for yourself. It's a gift that you have to pay forward. Clause 61 of the Magna Carta is where we get the right of the people to petition the government for a redress of their grievances. We didn't invent that. We inherited it. Now we have a promise that kings must keep and a mechanism to make them keep it. But let me ask you a question, human nature in mind. How many of you think that kings being told what to do by people is going to go over well with kings? It is not. So the next 400 years, the people are going to be battling with their kings and queens to keep their limited government and to maintain their liberty. So we're going to fast forward to this king. His name is Charles I. Charles I is a young, handsome king, and in history is described as being a bit of a party animal. The people speak of Charles, and they say that Charles loves to romp about Europe, spending on his every whim and fancy. Now, I don't know if he played golf, but doesn't this, I mean, whose money is he spending? Whose money is Charles spending? How is he collecting it? Taxes. Doesn't that kind of prove we've been paying for vacations for a long time? Well, here's the thing. That royal council created in 1215 is now called Parliament. And Parliament gets sick and tired of Charles' wasteful spending, stands up to Charles and says, hey, we're not passing any more of your laws until you get your spending under control. Can you recognize now that in 1625, we have separation of powers? We have a legislative branch telling the executive branch that they're going to defund it if it doesn't get a proper budget. Novel idea, right? Well, Charles says, okay, fine, but let me remind you something. I'm king. Why do I even need a parliament? And he dissolves Parliament. Now, he didn't have to call in the sergeant-at-arms to remove Parliament from the court. Perhaps he just stood up and told the people, you realize that as king, that I must provide you with security and services, and Parliament is impeding this action. So I'll make a promise to you. If Parliament will not legislate, I'm going to go ahead and regulate.
Yeah, I have a pen.
Or perhaps he just said, if Parliament will not make laws, I will. After all, I have a quill and a messenger. Isn't that the same as dissolving Parliament, declaring them irrelevant and powerless? And then if they act like it, they are, aren't they?
Yeah.
Well, Charles realizes that he has to have money to live the way he wants to live. And he realizes that he has just dissolved Parliament, so it would be an unconstitutional act for him to pass a tax by decree. Now, he can issue a law from the throne without Parliament, but he cannot be a tax. Now, Charles has learned from his predecessors that if you attack the liberty too much, too quickly, the people will hold a sword at your throat. So he comes to the people and he says, you know, we have to have money to make government function. So here's what we're going to do. I realize that we're going to be doing this without Parliament, so don't worry. I'm going to issue a decree to collect your money, but it's not going to be a tax. See, I'll prove it to you it's not a tax. You see, I'm calling it a forced loan. See, you just have to pay me money, and I promise that I'll pay you back later. The people aren't buying it. 5 knights stand up to Charles and say, guess what? Tax mandate, we don't care what you call this, we're not paying it. Charles arrests the 5 knights, denies them their right to due process, and a rebellion comes against Charles. But I do have to wonder, if Charles had possessed a little bit of modern wisdom, if he could have avoided the whole rebellion thing, if he instead hadn't called his tax a forced loan, but had instead called it Social Security. Isn't that exactly what Social Security is? You have to pay the government, and they promise to pay you back sometime in the future. Well, the rebellion against Charles brings us the 3rd document in the history of our Constitution. It is called the Petition of Right of 1628, and the sword does come to Charles' throat. The Petition of Right of 1628 says there'll be no taxation without representation, regardless of what you call it. Yes, we have a right to due process. That is not something that government can give and take away based on their needs and convenience. But while we've got the sword at the king's throat, we're going to secure more liberty for the people and limit government even more. King. You cannot declare martial law on us unless we're actually at war, being invaded by a foreign nation. And you cannot quarter soldiers in our homes. Now that's part of our Bill of Rights. Who can tell me what amendment that is?
Third.
Very good. The Third Amendment. No quartering soldiers in the homes. Charles is going to sign the Petition of Right, and the people are going to let him remain king. Do you think maybe the people thought he learned a lesson? Well, Charles did learn one lesson, that if you're going to spend the people's money, you can't whim and fancy it. You have to be able to give them an excuse so they want to give you money. And the years between 1628 and 1641 provide Charles with that perfect excuse. There are wars everywhere in Europe. And Charles is able to come to his people and say, hey, do you see all those wars our friends are fighting in their foreign lands? I have a very important question for you. Do you want those wars to come to our kingdom? Well, of course not. But I have the perfect plan to keep those wars from ever coming here. You see, all you have to do is give me your tax dollars. And when you give me your tax dollars, I will fund all our allies in their wars. So they'll be superior in power and strength, and then they will win those wars over there. And if they win those wars over there, what does that mean for us? They won't come here, right? I told you it was the perfect plan. It's just a matter of national security that you pay your taxes. Problem is, the people are watching Charles very closely. And they're noticing that Charles is lying. Charles is not funding their allies. He's funding their enemies. Because the enemies have made a deal with Charles that the allies wouldn't make. I help you win over there. You come over here and get my people back under subjection with me. Charles is brought up on charges of treason, found guilty, and sentenced to death. A process which gives us our fourth document called the Grand Remonstrance of 1641. This is an absolutely brilliant document where they look at that oracle of truth. They pick up that lamp of history and they draw some very important conclusions. They say the root of all this mischief we find to be a malignant and pernicious design, subverting the fundamental laws and liberties of our kingdom. You know what they're saying? We've been watching government for about 600 years now, and we're beginning to notice a pattern. The same bag of tricks over and over and over again. And the list of grievances, according to Clause 61 of the Magna Carta in the Grand Remonstrance, tell us that grand scheme. Are you ready? Corruption of the court system. Infiltration of foreign law. The government diminishing the property rights of the people. The government sticking its influence into the church. The government creating fiat money to manipulate the people through the monetary system. And the government disarming the people while the government remained armed. And those who do not know their history are doomed to repeat its mistakes. Are you guys familiar with Agenda 21 here? Would you be interested in knowing that the United Nations and UNESCO did not invent sustainable development? Go read the Grand Remonstrance of 1641 and you'll see amongst the grievances of the people that they were overthrowing and chopping off Charles' head because he was taking the private land from the landowners in the name of resource preservation, and I quote now from the document, depopulation. They also said that Charles was trying to remove them from the gold and silver standard by creating brass fiat money, and for that they chopped off his head. Now, before you get too excited, we're still working with kings. And this king, James I, has been studying his history, and he knows that he can take whatever he wants from the people as long as he gives them something to distract them from their taking. James is going to come to the people and say, I'm going to give you something you've never had before. I am going to give you religious liberty. I'm going to issue a decree that says you no longer have to be a member of the Church of England. You can have church anywhere you want, anytime you want, with any pastor you want. Preach anything you want. On one condition. Before you have church, you must inform the king where you'll be meeting, when you'll be meeting, who will be preaching, what will be said, and you must promise that you will never talk bad about the king in church. How many of you, by show of hands, think that sounds like religious liberty? How many of you, by show of hands, think that sounds exactly like a 501c3? Well, I practiced First Amendment law for over 2 years. I'm going to tell you, it is exactly a 501c3. When your church is duped into thinking it needs permission from the IRS to operate, they have to send an application to the IRS in which they declare the name of the church, they declare the board of directors of the church who will be preaching. They have to declare the address of the church, where they will be preaching at. They must also be prepared to support the fact that they are a religious organization, so they must tell them what they're going to be preaching. And they must also promise that they will never talk about government. How is it that back then, the people knew that was a mark of an evil and oppressive government? They bring a rebellion against James. 7 bishops actually stand up to James and say, you know what? We have a promise over 600 years or 500 years old that says we don't have to listen to you in our church. So guess what? We're going to preach whatever we want, however we want, with whomever we want. And we're not following your decree. James actually arrests these 7 bishops, throws them in prison, and charges them with a crime called seditious libel. Now he's going to make sure they have their day in court, because he's learned from Charles, when you deny due process, they chop off your head. But James has nothing to fear, because the crime of seditious libel he's had written in such a way that truth is no defense. So even if you were talking truth about the king, you still have to die. But here's the good news. 7 bishops did get their day in court. 2 of them had their charges dismissed because they had judges who refused to enforce an unconstitutional decree. The other 5 were found not guilty because they had a jury of their peers who refused to find them guilty of an unconstitutional law. You see, we did not invent the right to a trial by jury, nor did we invent the essential check and balance of jury nullification. We inherited them. The rebellion against James brings us the final document in the history of our Constitution, the English Bill of Rights of 1689. Whereas the late King James II, by the assistance of evil judges and counselors and ministers employed by him, did endeavor to subvert and extirpate the laws and liberties of the kingdom. I'll just admit to you, I will confess, I did not know what extirpate meant. So I looked it up. And it means to completely destroy. They said what James was doing was completely destroying their liberty. And then according to Clause 61 of the Magna Carta, they made a whole list of them. We're not going to go over the list, but I want to show you one. But before we go to that, I want to ask you a question. In the history that you have just learned this afternoon, how many of you see that history repeating today? Just a little bit? Just generally? Precisely, right? Let's look at this. They said that James was completely destroying liberty by writing law and overturning law and setting aside law when that is a power reserved to Parliament alone. Remember, we already have separation of powers, and these people of 1688, with no cell phones, no Google Oracle, no MSNBC, no CNN, no Fox News, knew that when the executive branch can write law, overturn law, and set aside laws created by the legislative branch, that is the complete destruction of liberty. And yet today, our presidents have been writing executive orders to overturn legislation for decades, and our Congress says nothing. Could it be that we've been teaching the wrong things for a very long time? Your last little bit of historical trivia. The power of the decree is the king's power to make law. The executive order of a king. When do you think the last executive order was ever written by a British king? Anybody want to guess what year? I mean, we recognize they still have a queen today, right? Yeah. Well, the last executive order ever written by a king was 1688. James II. It brought about the Glorious Revolution and the English Bill of Rights. Our presidents, for decades, have exercised more power than kings since 1688.
Chop off their heads.
Well, it's interesting because you now recognize that Thomas Jefferson did not invent the Declaration of Independence, nor did he invent liberty. As a matter of fact, Declaration of Independence is a legal requirement for all British citizens, according to Clause 61 of the Magna Carta, to petition the government for a redress of their grievances. Our founders, in writing the Declaration of Independence, were complying with the final realm of their kingdom. Petitioning for a redress. I think it's one thing that we don't teach in history, but it's absolutely true. Those who were declaring independence were hoping to the very moment of it that they would be reconciled with Great Britain. They didn't want civil war. And they still referred to Great Britain as their mother country. George III did not invent tyranny. He was just engaging in the malignant and pernicious design. Remember that one thing that they were searching for. John Adams said, "Liberty must at all hazards be supported. We have a right to it derived from our Maker. Your rights don't come from the Constitution. They come by the nature of your creation. Government is created to secure your rights because your rights pre-exist government." Yet when we allow government to redefine and regulate our rights, we transform the very nature of who we are into tributary slaves and make our rights into privileges conferred upon us by those in power. You have to be careful about your liberty, because there is an undeniable truth that if you want your child to be free, you must protect the liberty of your enemy as much as you would your own. This is such a powerful statement by Thomas Paine. He that would make his own liberty secure must guard even his enemy from oppression, for if he violates this duty, he establishes a precedent that will reach to himself. That's why it's important to have freedom of speech and freedom of religion. Because if the government can limit the speech that you don't like, how long before they don't like yours? If the government can deny someone the right to practice their religion, how long before they deny yours? Our founders gave life, liberty, or gave life, fortune, and sacred honor so we could be free. The sacrifices that they made just to secure the blessings of liberty to their posterity. Let me ask you something. Do you think that they deserved that sacrifice? Do you think that we deserve less? I mean, should our lives be easier than theirs? Should our sacrifice be less? Should we be able to maintain our liberty with less of a struggle and more compromise? Because here's the thing, the price of liberty is always eternal vigilance. And the moment we become ignorant, the moment we don't have liberty anymore. So we either believe what they did is something we must do. Now, I'm not talking about revolution here, so don't get all nervous. I'm not telling you got to go around chopping off heads, because the truth of the matter is, the greatest gift that our founders gave us was the opportunity to self-govern. And the greatest condemnation on America today is our refusal to self-govern. Even in our conservative circles, we have a habit of running to the federal government to fix all our problems, when those problems ought to be fixed at the state and local levels. Our founders sacrificed the way that they did so we wouldn't have to live in a kingdom, so we wouldn't have to chop off heads, so that we had peaceful means by which to control our government. But we have failed to teach the right things for so long. We don't even know what those solutions are anymore. So we end up looking in the wrong places, even though we want to do the right things. So we either believe that liberty is worth our every day, or we believe that he deserves less liberty. It's a choice that we all must make every single day. It is an individual choice. We must stop looking to politicians and politics and parties to fix our problems. We must get back to fixing them ourselves. Now, let me ask you this question again. How different would America be today if we had been teaching this history? How many of you know we're not teaching this in our schools?
Because the government controls the school.
That's right, and they're not supposed to. You know how you fix that?
Abolish the Department of Education.
You don't really have to abolish the Department of Education. You just have to simply deny their authority in your schools. You stop taking federal funding, and you tell them, guess what? There is no constitutional authority for a federal Department of Education. So since our Congress seems inept, powerless, and unable to actually do their job and defund and eliminate the Department of Education, we're simply going to deny your authority in our state, in our county. And once you do that, they have no power over you.
Other than the purse.
That's why you deny their money. If you turn down school money, they have no control over you. We have school districts in Texas who have turned down school money because they didn't want to impose the former president's lunch mandate. And when they turned down that money from the federal government, they found out they actually had more money by denying federal funding, because you run the numbers, you will find it costs you more money to take the money than it does to deny it, because you have to then comply with all the red strings and all the regulations which cost you. These schools, I'm not lying, we're finding out that with the federal funding, they were sometimes $30,000 in debt every single year they had to come up with. That's why your schools lose programs, not because they don't have the funding, because they have to keep paying the federal government to get the federal money. And when they kicked the federal government out, they never had to pay and comply with all the regulation. They were finding themselves $10,000, $20,000 ahead. They were able to provide for their own school lunches for children who could not afford, and they were providing better food that the kids were eating.
You don't hear about that in the media.
I absolutely will not hear about that in the media, because they don't want you to know that. You get a constitutional sheriff, and the federal government doesn't even have any jurisdiction in your county. Brad Rogers, Elkhart, Indiana, got so sick and tired of the USDA and the FDA raiding his Amish farmers over their weapons of mass destruction, you know, raw milk and cheese. that he wrote the USDA a letter explaining to them that they were to share that letter with their FDA friends, that if they were to come into his county again without first stopping by his office and obtaining his permission, he would arrest every single federal agent in his county trying to effectuate one of these warrants. That was 2 years ago, and he's never seen the USDA or the FDA in his jurisdiction again. And you won't hear about that in the media either. We can change the course of America if we start teaching this history to our children now. Out there on the table we have these 2 books which will teach the history to your children that I just taught you. Plus it has chapters on founders and framers that they cannot find anywhere else. If you go to my website, KrissanneHall.com, you can get a video of me teaching this class. It's about 45 minutes long, and it's teaching it to a middle school in in New Mexico, and you can use it to school your children no matter where they go to school. What do you think the most asked question I get as I travel around? How do we fix this, right? Here's the thing, if we'd been studying the Constitution the way we were supposed to be studying it for the last 150 years, we'd know how to fix it. But here's a book that I've written called Sovereign Duty that gives you the plan of action that our framers put into place for when the federal government gets out of control. How many think the federal government's out of control? Let me ask you this question. How many of you see history repeating that you just learned? How many of you believe that our framers knew that history and it's why they created the Constitution that we have today? So then why would it surprise us that they would also not anticipate the federal government that we have today? They absolutely anticipated a future history in which we became lazy in luxury, pacified in prosperity, and complacent and compliant in our comfort. And they gave us, in their own writing, the instructions on how to fix that. But we're not teaching it. And so this book will teach you how to do that. Your constitutional sheriff, the power of the states, Article 5 Convention, nullification, 4th Amendment, 2nd Amendment, all these things that we need to know to secure our liberty. Not only that, this book gives you all my research. So in the back of the book, every quote and every citation is, I'll give you the original source document of that. I want you to become the expert. I teach a 5-hour constitutional course on Saturdays that teaches the history of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, 1 through 10. That is available on a 3 DVD set of over 6 hours of teaching. And the Sovereign Duty book picks up where that leaves off. So on their table out there, we will give you a special offer. If you buy the 2 together, it's only $40 for the book and the DVD set. Do you remember that question that I asked you? Name all 5 liberties in the First Amendment? If you had trouble, then this is the book for you. I wrote this book after learning about that survey. This book not only teaches you just about those 5 liberties, it gives you the means and ideas on how to practically exercise them every day. Because if we are not exercising our rights every day, they are gone. You have to notice when they're missing, and if you're not using them, you never notice. August, we are starting an online university called Liberty First University. We will launch with 4 courses that contain 21 classes. The Constitution, civics, government, and American history, taught as if the founders were teaching it themselves. Absent the propaganda, absent the historical manipulations, taught just like I taught you today, not through my opinions, but through history and fact. And that's available to you if you go to libertyfirstuniversity.com. You can learn about that. One last announcement. How many of you know I'm going to be on C-SPAN in August? Yes. I will be on C-SPAN August 6th, starting at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. It's a 3-hour program they have every first Sunday of the month called In Depth. A 3-hour interview with just me. It's called 3 Hours, One Author, Your Calls. You get to call in and ask me questions. That is so awesome. Do you recognize the teaching tool that we have in our hands now to teach the American public about the Constitution through your questions? C-SPAN came and taped my state sovereignty class, and from that I had people contacting me saying, I never heard of you and I never believed like you do, but once I saw this class, you have changed my life. That's the power of what we're doing here. I have a radio show. How many of you listen to my radio show? How many of you just found out I have a radio show? All right. So if you don't have a local network that carries my radio show, but they can if they want to, I syndicate for free. You can go to my website for the radio show. You can download my radio show, a mobile app to your phone. We have all of these resources available to you. Now, by show of hands, how many of you know a school that needs to hear this history? High school, middle school, or college? How many of you know a church that needs to learn the truth about religious liberty? How many of you know a sheriff, a councilman, or a county commissioner that needs to know their job? Okay? How many of you know a state legislator, a governor, and an attorney general that needs to know their job? How many of you think that we should be teaching this in Washington, D.C.? All right, now let me ask you this question. You've all answered this. How many of you would you like me to come and teach again? All right, here's the thing. I teach churches, schools, I teach anywhere. I don't care. I've taught in some amazing, I taught in a cow pasture one time. I will go anywhere. But you have to invite me.
You're invited.
Listen to me because I want you to know how dedicated we are to this. I have no speaking fees. I don't make any groups pay for our expenses or our travel. Now, we are not independently wealthy, and in spite of what the rumors might say, we have never taken any money from the Koch brothers or George Soros. But because they never offered.
Take it all.
But you see, we believe that liberty is a gift from God. And we believe, and I have fallen completely in love with those who gave it to us. We are just trying to pass something forward on to our friends and families and our future. Because it's in our hearts to do so. And because we believe that God is the author of our liberty, we also know He is our provider. We rely completely on donations and what we sell to keep us going. And for 7 years now, I have taught at least 260 classes in over 22 states. And we can keep doing that. Because all you have to do is invite us. It's not going to cost you a dime. But what's it costing our future for us to remain ignorant? How many of you admit that you learned a lot today? And we all agreed we need to know it everywhere. So help us keep going by inviting us. The more meetings we get, the more we can teach. Go to Liberty First University, and then you can have this training in your homes. Encourage your teachers to keep these classes in their classrooms and homeschool co-ops and everywhere. You can have groups where you can just teach my classes from Liberty First University. But you are now the holders of truth. And to whom much is given, much is required. Thank you so much for your time. God bless.
Thank you, Krissanne. That was powerful, and it was stimulating and it was motivating. And the important thing is that we don't go home today and let this drop. I mean, this is such an important message, and there's so much to be learned. Please find your way past that table and grab some DVDs and some books. You can come on down this aisle and Krissanne will sign them. One other thing, over the months, over the years, we've been trying to encourage young people to come to these forums. This is the kind of thing young people need to hear. So I'd like to give one of Kellyanne's books, Krissanne's books free to the youngest person in the room. So given that I kind of know the demography here, how many are under 40? Okay, how about under 30? You got one, two? How about under 20? Under 20? I see one. Anybody else? Okay, two. How about under 15?
He doesn't count, that's my son.
Oh, okay. Your name is? Lily? Here's a book from Krissanne. I'm sure she'll sign it for you. Thanks for coming. Bring your friends next time. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We'll see you next month on Electromagnetic Pulse. Meanwhile, grab a book, grab a DVD, and come back and say hello to Krissanne.
Things get harder. The bones get stiffer. This is interesting.